Hey, welcome back to Brighter Rays. We are looking at Genesis 47, and today we're looking at verses 27 through 31. We're going to see how Jacob is fruitful and multiplies. Now, the final section of our chapter begins the end of the story, right? It begins the end of the end, the end of the beginning, however you want to say. And it'll spread across the next few chapters until the end of this book. In Egypt, Israel settled and they gained possessions in it. If it were not for Joseph, their possessions and possibly their lives would have been forfeit. They would have lost everything. But in Egypt, in the land of their affliction, they are blessed by God. You see the contrast here, don't you? The Egyptians gave all their money, possessions, land, and their service to Pharaoh, while Israel gained possessions. It says they were fruitful and multiplied. As Moses uses the phrase, our minds go back to the first use where God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. After the flood, Noah's family was to be fruitful and multiply. Here again, at a new beginning, right? It's a new beginning here. Israel was to be fruitful and multiply. They were to be made into a great nation here in Egypt. We can't help but seeing that God is a covenant God. He's a promise-keeping God. That's what he does. That's who he is. Time and the people have changed here, but really God's promises have not changed at all. It just keeps going on and on and on. From the first time he promised something, that promise is carried through. It's carried through all the way through. And that first promise that he made to Adam and Eve, that there would be an offspring of the woman to crush the serpent's head, that line of promise has gone through the generations. And it picks up all these people along the way and carries them along until you get to the Messiah in Jesus Christ. And then it just explodes from there. You know, the promise doesn't die there. It doesn't stop there. Then it just explodes out all over the place. Now it's everyone. You know, it's the entire world. All these different people groups, all the Gentiles from every nation, every tribe, every language now is being included into the people of God. It's pretty amazing. But that promise began in Genesis when the fall happened. So we've seen that throughout Genesis, and we see it here again with Jacob's family. And that's where that recurring theme, that mention again of being fruitful and multiply, comes back again. All the way back to creation, right? Oh, this is my promise, this is my blessing upon you. Be fruitful and multiply. So God's been faithful. That shows us again that God is faithful. He hasn't changed, right? He's still giving people the ability to be fruitful and multiply all the way through. And so we see all those promises that God makes. None of them really end. None of them are really, none of them really come to like a fulfillment. It really gets to a place where then they just expand so great, they just expand out for all eternity. And so that's how God works his covenants. You think, well, that's pretty easily solved, but really God just goes above and beyond all the time. Now back to our story. Jacob would spend 17 years in the land of Goshen and would not return alive to Canaan. He was 147 years old when he dies. Now, the famine only lasted until Jacob's 135th year, right? Why didn't he return to Canaan then? Why didn't he go back? Well, I refer you back to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is a very great insight, and we should not read into, we don't want to read Genesis without Hebrews, because there's a lot of great little tidbits in there that we may not see if we're just reading through Genesis. So Hebrews 11 says, these all died, speaking of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. So they saw the promises, right? That's what it says in here. Let me step out of the verse for a minute. It says they saw them from afar. They could see the promise. They could see the promise, over there. It's doing its thing. It's working. It's growing. But they didn't fully receive it. So and it says, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. That's what Jacob says, right? That he is a sojourner, that he is an exile. He's on a pilgrimage. He doesn't belong there. But he's doesn't belong in Egypt. But what does it say in Hebrews? That they were strangers and exiles where? In Egypt? No. It says they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They don't even belong on the planet, is what they're saying. So, for people who speak thus, it says, back in verse 14, it says, for people who speak thus, make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. Now, what homeland are they seeking? If they're an exile and sojourners on the planet, what homeland are they seeking then? Is it here on the planet? No. Because it says, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, which land did they go out of? They left the land of promise. They left Canaan. If they were thinking about Canaan, they would have had the opportunity to return. Now, did Jacob have the opportunity to return? The famine was over. The land starts growing stuff again. People are living there, right? I mean, by the time that Joshua gets in there, even before that, even before the people enter into the promised land, the land is filled with, it's flowing with milk and honey. It's a great place again. So, you're talking about 400 years or 300 and some odd years at this point. The land is back. The land is great. Even for Jacob, how long did it take for the land to come back? I don't know. They start planting again, it starts raining again, or whatever reason why they're the famine, we don't know. But, people start living in the land of Canaan again. It's all good. So, did he have the opportunity to return? They would have had the opportunity to return. They could have done it, but they don't. Then in the verse 16 it says, but as it is, they desire a country, a better country. The one they left, right? Better than Canaan. That is a heavenly one. So they're seeking a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He's not ashamed to be called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not ashamed of that, because they weren't looking for just things of this earth. It says, for he has prepared for them a city. So that's an amazing verse. Hebrews 11 really puts a whole different idea on this whole, doesn't it? It makes us think like they could have returned if they wanted to, if that was the land that they were seeking. But they were seeking a homeland, and it wasn't a homeland on earth. It was a heavenly one, it says. They were seeking a heavenly country. So it's interesting to put that in perspective. You put that into the story. What's Jacob? Jacob's afraid to leave the land of Canaan, but that's not ultimately what he's looking for, to just stay there. He knows that's not the end. That's not the end game. So I think we don't give enough credit and understanding to these men, and I think that's been an issue for a lot of Christians. We think, they kind of separate that out, but really they understood, this is not my home. I'm in exile here. This earth is not my home. I'm just a sojourner. No matter where I go, if I'm in Canaan, I'm sojourning. That's what they did. They lived in tents. That's what Hebrews says. They didn't see that as their permanent home. They were living there. Now God promised that land that they were on, but then they're still like, okay, this is not what we're looking for. This is not the end game here. So pretty amazing thing to think about. But we need to include Hebrews 11 when we're thinking about these stories. Now, finally, we jump some time ahead in the story and back in Genesis here. And we have a scene from Jacob's life as his health is declining and he feels that, death is coming. Jacob begins to set his life in order. He begins to set his affairs in order here at the end of his life. So he calls Joseph to him and makes him swear an oath, in the same way that Abraham made his servant swear by placing his hand under his thigh. He makes Joseph swear that he would not be buried in Egypt, but that he would be buried in the cave at Machpelah, where Abraham and Isaac were laid to rest. Though we might have our doubts about Jacob's trust and faith in God over the years that we've studied him, we find him here nearing his death, worshiping God. It says, then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed, or in some translations, as the Septuagint says, over his staff. So, the Septuagint says that he bowed his head over his staff, which is what the author of Hebrews cites when he says that Jacob bowed in worship over the head of his staff. God has been faithful to Jacob all these years, and Jacob enters the last days of his life worshiping his Lord. May this be true of all of us when death comes. May we be found to be worshiping our Lord, bowing our head over our staff, over that of our bed, in worship of God at the end of our lives. That's my hope for myself. That's my hope for you too. That's where you would be found when the end of life comes for you too.